So I've been left with some thoughts due to the Epic lawsuit kicking around in my head. You know, I really should read the whole thing because a lot of disclosures end up taking place in court that, confessions that you wouldn't ordinarily see, or that, like we ended up finding out that, Fox News doesn't have much respect for their own audience, to say the least, per the lawsuits. Like they just tell people what they want, they know that they want to hear at this point, and they say that only a fool could take the people that are on there seriously on these whole things. I mean, if you follow the lawsuits, you would end up realizing that they have absolutely no respect for their actual core audience. But so the thing is that I sorry for the stuttering. I'm just kind of thinking in my head. That's what, waiting for the processing internally to catch up to the reality. So the thing is that Apple is engaged in security theater. In summary, I used to think that the App Store was great for people who didn't want to really worry or have to deal with all these security threats and everything, and to have to deal with all of that hassle and everything. And I would say that even though this approach isn't for me, because I prefer the dangerous freedom of just being able to get the APK from wherever I want and going over to F-Droid and everything, and switch between, apps to make sure that I'm covered no matter what they try to censor. The truth of the matter is that I was bothered, and I've long loathed the App Store approach because, I worry that this is a company's way of trying to create, on the internet, a like sort of digital place where you're a captive audience who, has to pay the tribute fee to the business that you're inside during the time that you're inside it. I mean, if you've ever gone into Disney World, you know that getting a drink inside Disney World can be outrageously expensive, compared to what it is on the outside of the place, because you're there in the parks and it's going to be hours and hours and hours before you can actually get anywhere to get a drink. So be prepared to pay an extra, arm and a leg to get a drink inside their parks, once you're neck deep inside. And, just as a travel tip for you, as somebody that was a former Disney insider, I mean, I've been inside. So, just so you know. And the thing is that, the thing about the App Store though is just, I used to think, that this was, more secure approach than, the freedom that I've come to embrace and everything, and that I've experienced on the PC. I mean, as much as I hate it, at least, there's somebody looking over there and curating the experience and everything. But then, the curators basically came forward and we saw the job postings for them, and many of them are not required to have extensive experience with iOS. They're just there to review, and basic, and they give these apps maybe, less, some of them they give less than a minute of review too before they make a decision ultimately, and all this. And that is hardly enough time to do a real security audit on any of this stuff. And there's a term for this, and this is called security theater that we're looking at. Basically Apple is not actually doing a better job of providing security than Android. It's doing a better job of posturing security than Android. You know, the truth of the matter too is that, very little seems to live on after a reboot and gain persistence on either Android or Apple. They're very good at fighting against any malware actually surviving a reboot of the system. So, I just, they're not very easily practically targetable platforms unless you do a swim swapping attack sort of thing. Like, but I just ultimately, like, am trying to point out that, you know uh, the the truth of the matter, you know, and about about all of this is, you know, a lot more extensively complicated, you know, and everything than I realized at the time. And my observations were just kind of surface level. I was not aware of the deeper fundamental reality of things. I was just basically saying, you know, my impressions at the time were that the App Store was great for people because, you know, you at least were able to have somebody that had some sort of curation. It just wasn't an approach that I considered for me because I was much more used to the inherent freedom and flexibility that you had on Windows as an operating system, or Linux even, if you were Linux curious the way that I was and have been forever. You know, like you know, I was practically born chained to a terminal, man. Like I've been curious about that shit since I was 13. So you know I. I've become. I think I was actually rather infamous at the time for some of my rants against Linux. At the time, you know, I was like, I want to love this operating system, but you keep telling me to use the man pages, and the man pages at the time sucked. You know, because like part of the problem is there's so much jargon in these goddamn, you know, things that, you know, they're meant for a technical audience and not for, you know, the average everyday normie user who's trying to come over and learn all of this IT shit and everything. You know, it takes a graybeard person who's been working in IT forever to even understand the fucking man pages. I mean, where do you go if you're too, like, so fucking fundamentally new to all of this shit? You don't know shit. You don't even have beginner's experience, you know, at, you know, using the operating system. Where do you go to learn how all that shit, you know, and everything, to just break your teeth at using it and everything? You know, where do you go for that? And, you know, I like Linux. I like its approach. I like the fact that it's freer. I like the fact that it's open source, which, you know, encourages everybody to get curious about, you know, how things look under the hood. It encourages them to start thinking about programming and everything else. And, you know, even if they aren't programmers or don't want to learn, there's still somebody else that knows their shit and is looking under the hood, you know, at the way that everything looks and works and everything. And, you know, the I don't like what everybody else is doing. I don't like their approach, and I've already noted, you know, for instance, the existence of back orifice. I've talked about it. I've talked about the 2000 error and the way that hackers deliberately targeted the low-hanging fruit of Microsoft's operating system just to point out, you know, to poke a hole at it and basically say that, you know, this is not a secure platform, you know, like, you know, like it's a joke. The security on here is a bit of a joke and everything, and, you know, obviously I'm using Microsoft. I mean, I can't hide that from the viewer. I'm using Windows to record at the moment. I'm not able to ultimately obscure that reality from you, but, you know, I do know and note that security has come a long way as well on Windows compared to where it was operating before and everything. It's become a much more secure platform than the way that it was before, to say the least. But I just I want, you know, Microsoft has made a lot of progress. Let's give them credit for that much. I just, but, you know, that I was born in that kind of environment. It was either that or Linux, and, you know, I've used both, you know, in my time and everything, and, you know, I've got a perspective that hails from both worlds and everything, and so, you know, I'm a weird hybrid creature that, you know, basically uses both Linux and, you know, uh, Windows. Like, I like both. I have, well, I mean, I don't like Microsoft. I just don't have the same pathological loathing of that I do of Apple. See, I don't like the App Store approach. I've never liked the App Store approach. I've never been a big fan of it. I've noted that it would be great for people who wanted a curator to make sure that all this shit was secure, or, you know, compared to the danger of just being able to get your applications anywhere. You know, part of the problem in Microsoft land is that there's so much freedom that it becomes dangerous, and you become prey to anybody who, unless you're careful and cautious about where you get your applications from, and even to some extent, even engaging in signature checks and everything to make sure that everything, the data was replicated properly, or that some malicious binary hasn't ultimately replaced the, uh, hacked in and replaced the binary that was on the site, and everything, and to check this that the signatures match and everything. I mean, these approaches have been taken here, on and everything. Things have truly they've become more secure on here. That doesn't mean that things haven't found ways to evade the new defenses. That is, we're seeing all kinds of bootkits and everything and phenomenon start to take place, and I'm not saying otherwise, but those are inherent threats that even Apple has to face, the reality of, and if you can target a system at boot time, it doesn't matter who the vendor is, the system's fucked. Because that shit boots up before any kind of system does to secure the basic input output systems. That's it. That's the root of the system. I mean, you get into that, you can do whatever you want to it, and you know the the problem with Apple is that they posture better than Android about security. You feel safer using it. It's like driving an SUV. You know, Americans think bigger means if my car hits something smaller than me, that I'm safer than that car below me is fucked. That's a problem for them. Hurrah, hurrah. What Americans usually don't think is, for instance, everybody else on the road, almost all the cars on it at this point are driving SUVs. So if I get hit by anything, it's likely going to be another SUV, and they don't think about things like, oh, for instance, they don't examine it and realize things like, um, statistically, the types of accidents that take place usually aren't like, head-on collisions. They're usually like fender benders, like minor, um, you know, uh, somebody rear ends you, somebody makes an illegal turn and ends up swiping you on the side, and those are the kinds of accidents that tend to take place. You're either back impact or side impact. Frontal. Like it almost takes in order for somebody to collide with you head on, it almost takes somebody heading the wrong way down the road, and why those things can happen, especially in very dark conditions out there when it can take place. I mean, I faced a reality like that, unfortunately, as a passenger when my mom tried to take me to school in the pitch black. Because of how early classes started. My mom has trouble with night vision, so that was a nightmare. I had to hit the brake. Mom, turn around. You're on the wrong side of the road. You're in a really dangerous zone to be driving in. Fortunately, there wasn't much traffic around, and we were able to navigate out of that situation. You know, but that was worrying, and the that was a long time ago, though. I mean, a very long time ago. But no, I mean, it almost takes somebody heading the wrong way down the road to cause that. And, what's the statistical likelihood of that happening? And yeah, I mean, if you hit a sedan heading head on in an SUV, yeah, that sedan's fucked. But, you know, the problem in, such a huge way is that, the center of gravity in an SUV is higher off the ground, which means that the rollover risk is just disproportionately higher than it would be in a sedan. A sedan, suffers a side impact, from somebody making the wrong turn. That sedan may, it may get hurt, and the car may need to be totaled and replaced, but, you're not going to, experience a fatal rollover, where everything is so disabled that you can't even get out of the way, and you're likely facing so many injuries that you're not able to get out of the car as effectively, upside down, and you're now obstructing traffic. You know, the truth of the matter is that SUVs are actually inherently more dangerous than sedans. The problem with the market at this point is that the companies don't care. They don't care, and the ones that do are just teaching their people how to deal with these problems rather than simply discouraging them from buying it. And part of the reason for all of this is that these car companies like these giant vehicles and selling them to you because they're not subject to cafe standards on fuel efficiency. But I'm saving up to buy a car myself, but fuck you, to the manufacturers. I'm not buying a fucking SUV. I'm not buying anything that the government classifies as a light truck. I'm buying the cars that I do because of the cafe standards. I like saving money on gas. But no, looking out there, I didn't come to learn these things because of the fact that I like to defend the decision I made or because I want to feel good about driving this sort of thing. I came to realize that there was a difference between perceived safety and actual safety. So I would say that the App Store is perceived as a safer approach. It's perceived as though it's curated. It's perceived as though Apple, is providing a greater, you know, more secure environment for the end user, but they're not in reality in actual practice. Apple is not better than Android on security. It's better at posturing security.